The village of Omulore was a peaceful place where the only sounds at night were the crickets and the occasional owl. Emeka was a hard-working young man who lived in a small brick house, roofed with rusted iron sheets. He spent his days working on his cocoa farm and his evenings drinking palm wine with his friends under the big aroko tree. Life was simple and predictable until a Tuesday night that changed everything for him. He had just finished eating a bowl of pounded yam and egusi soup before falling into a deep sleep on his foam mattress. Suddenly, a loud vibration coming from his wooden bedside table startled him out of his dreams. He reached for his small smartphone and saw the screen glowing brightly in the dark room. The time displayed on the screen was exactly 3:17 a.m., which was a very strange time for anyone to be awake. There was no phone number showing on the screen, and the caller ID simply said unknown number. Emeka hesitated for a moment because he did not know anyone who would call him at such an ungodly hour. He eventually swiped the screen to answer the call, but he heard nothing but absolute silence. He stayed on the line for almost a minute, asking, "Hello? Who is this?" several times without getting a response. Just as he was about to end the call, he heard a very faint and heavy sound of breathing. It was not a normal breath. It sounded like someone who had been running a long distance or someone who was very afraid. Emeka felt a cold shiver run down his spine, even though the night air was warm and humid. He quickly pressed the red button to end the call and tossed the phone away from him. He tried to go back to sleep, but the sound of that heavy breathing kept playing over and over in his mind. The next morning, Emeka woke up with a heavy head and went about his chores as if nothing had happened. He wore his favorite faded Ankara shirt and headed to the village market to buy some new farm tools. By the time he returned home in the evening, he had almost forgotten about the strange phone call from the previous night. He sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the hills and greeted his neighbor, Mr. Okoro, who was busy fixing a hole in his fence. Mr. Okoro was a kind old man who lived in a beautiful house made of modern cement blocks directly across the street from Emeka. That night, Emeka went to bed early because he was feeling very tired from the day's work. However, his eyes flew open at exactly 3:17 a.m., even before his phone started to ring. When the phone finally vibrated, he felt a sense of dread that he could not explain to anyone. He answered the call on the first ring, and this time a voice that sounded like a dry leaf scraping against stone spoke to him. "Do not sleep tonight, Emeka," the voice whispered before the line went completely dead. Emeka sat up in bed, wondering how the caller knew his name and why he was being told to stay awake. He laughed nervously to himself and decided that it must be a prank played by one of his friends from the palm wine joint. He forced himself to close his eyes and eventually fell back into a light, restless sleep. He was suddenly woken up by the smell of smoke and the sound of people screaming at the top of their lungs. He rushed outside in his wrappers and saw that Mr. Okoro's house across the street was covered in giant orange flames. The fire was so intense that nobody could get close enough to save the old man or his properties. Emeka stood there in shock, realizing that the warning from the phone call had been real. For the next 3 days, Emeka could not eat or sleep properly because the image of the fire was burned into his memory. He kept looking at his phone, waiting for it to ring again, while also wishing that it would stay silent forever. The villagers gathered at the village square to talk about the tragedy, calling it an act of the gods or a spiritual attack. Emeka wanted to tell them about the phone call, but he was afraid that they would accuse him of being a wizard or a killer. He kept his secret to himself and stayed inside his house, wearing a simple white singlet and brown trousers. On the fourth night, the phone rang again at exactly 3:17 a.m. and Emeka's heart began to beat like a drum. He picked up the phone with trembling hands and waited for the mysterious voice to speak to him once more. Tomorrow, at the Big Bend, on the road to the city, a blue bus will lose its brakes, the voice said calmly. Emeka tried to ask who the caller was, but the person hung up before he could finish his sentence. He spent the rest of the night pacing around his small room, wondering if he should go to the bus park to warn the drivers. In the morning, he walked down to the main road and saw a blue commercial bus loading passengers who were dressed in colorful lace and ankara for a wedding. He approached the driver and told him to check his brakes, but the man only laughed and told Emeka to mind his own business. Emeka stood by the roadside and watched as the bus drove away, feeling a deep sense of helplessness in his chest. 2 hours later, news reached the village that a blue bus had crashed at the Big Bend, causing many injuries to the passengers. Emeka sat down on the floor of his kitchen and cried because he knew that the voice was never wrong. The people of Omolau began to notice that Emeka was acting very strange and looking very pale. He no longer went to the farm, and he spent most of his time staring at his phone as if it were a dangerous snake. Whenever he saw someone he knew heading towards a particular place, he would find a way to stop them or warn them. One afternoon, he saw his cousin Chidi wearing a fine agbada and preparing to go to the river to fish. Emeka remembered the warning he had received the night before about the drowning incident at the river. He grabbed Chidi by the arm and begged him not to go, claiming that he had a very bad feeling about the water today. Chidi looked at him with confusion and asked if Emeka was starting to see visions like a village prophet. "Oh, I am serious, Chidi. Please stay at home and help me fix my roof instead," Emeka pleaded with tears in his eyes. Chidi eventually agreed to stay, mostly because he wanted to help his cousin, who seemed to be losing his mind. Later that evening, they heard that a heavy tree had fallen into the river, exactly where Chidi usually sat to fish. If Chidi had been there, he would have been crushed to death by the heavy wood and put under the deep water. Chidi came to Emeka's house that night to thank him, bringing a small keg of fresh palm wine as a gift. While they sat together, Chidi asked Emeka how he knew that something bad was going to happen at the river. Emeka looked at his phone on the table and felt a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He realized that he was becoming a prophet of doom, and he hated the burden that the phone calls had placed on his life. As the weeks went by, the warnings from the mysterious caller became more personal and much more frequent. The voice no longer spoke about strangers or general accidents. It started naming people that Emeka loved dearly. One night, the voice warned him about his younger sister, Adago, who lived in the next village with her husband. The voice told him that a thief would enter her house through the back window if she did not lock it with a metal bar. Emeka ran through the forest in the middle of the night, carrying a heavy stick and wearing nothing but his shorts. He arrived at Adago's house just in time to see a shadow trying to pry open the wooden shutters of her kitchen window. He screamed so loudly that the thief got scared and jumped over the fence, disappearing into the dark bushes. Adago and her husband came outside shaking with fear and wondered how Emeka knew to come at such an hour. He could not give them a proper explanation, so he just told them that he had a dream that troubled his spirit. They thanked him and gave him some food, but Emeka could see the suspicion in their eyes as he left. When he got back home, he realized that he was no longer living a normal life because he was always waiting for the next disaster. He started to look old and tired, and his eyes were always red from lack of sleep and constant worrying. He began to wonder if the caller was a ghost, a demon, or perhaps a guardian angel sent to protect the village. He tried to call the number back many times, but a lady's voice always told him that the number did not exist. The mystery was eating him alive, and he felt like he was trapped in a nightmare that had no end. The people of Omula were not fools, and they began to notice that Emeka was always present whenever a tragedy was avoided. Some people started calling him a hero, but many others began to whisper that he was the one causing the problems in the first place. They argued that a man cannot know the future unless he is the one planning the evil events behind the scenes. The village elders summoned him to the palace of the king, who sat on a high throne wearing a grand agbada made of expensive velvet. Emeka stood before them, feeling very small and afraid as they stared at him with stern faces. The king asked Emeka to explain how he knew about the fire, the bus crash, and the attempted robbery at his sister's house. Emeka looked at the floor and told them that he simply had a very strong intuition and that God was showing him things in his sleep. One of the elders laughed mockingly and accused Emeka of belonging to a secret society that sacrificed people for power. They warned him that if any other bad thing happened in the village, they would hold him responsible and banish him. Emeka left the palace with a heavy heart, knowing that his attempts to save people were turning the whole village against him. Emeka returned to his house and locked the door, feeling like a prisoner in his own home. He sat on his wooden stool and looked at his phone, which sat on the table like a sleeping beast. He wondered if he should just smash the device against the wall and end the madness once and for all. However, he was terrified that if he destroyed the phone, people would die because he wouldn't be there to warn them. He spent the evening wearing a simple brown Ankara wrapper, staring at the shadows dancing on the wall from his kerosene lamp. The weight of the secret was becoming too heavy for one man to carry alone in a village where gossip spread like a bushfire. He thought about his mother, who lived in another town, and wondered if she would believe him if he told her the truth. Every time the wind blew against his window, he jumped, thinking it was the sound of the elders coming to take him away. He realized that saving lives was a lonely job that brought no reward, only fear and isolation. As the clock crawled toward midnight, he began to shake, knowing that the 3:17 a.m. call was only a few hours away. The night was very silent, and the moon was hidden behind thick black clouds, making the village darker than usual. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the phone vibrated, and the light from the screen illuminated Emeka's tired and sweaty face. He picked it up quickly, his fingers trembling as he pressed the button to receive the call. The voice sounded even more tired this time, and it spoke with a sense of urgency that made Emeka's blood run cold. "Your best friend Chidi is going to the forest to set traps for bushmeat at dawn. Tell him to stay away from the big silk cotton tree." Emeka didn't even wait for the call to end before he jumped up and grabbed his torchlight and his rubber sandals. He ran through the narrow paths of the village, his heart hammering against his ribs as he headed toward Chidia's house. He found Chidi sharpening his cutlass by the light of a small lantern, preparing for his early morning hunting trip. Emeka grabbed the cutlass from his hand and begged him, with tears in his eyes, not to go near the forest today. Chidi looked at his friend's ragged appearance and felt a deep sense of pity, because Emeka looked like a man who had seen a ghost. Chidi agreed to stay home, but he insisted that Emeka should lie down and rest, because he was clearly losing his mind. As they sat on the bench outside, a loud, thunderous sound echoed from the forest, shaking the very ground they sat upon. They ran toward the sound and saw that the giant silk cotton tree had suddenly collapsed, crushing everything beneath it for several meters. If Chidi had gone to set his traps at the usual time, he would have been smashed into the earth by the massive trunk. Chidi turned to look at Emeka, his face turning pale as he realized that his friend had truly saved his life again. However, a group of villagers who were also heading to their farms saw the two friends standing by the fallen tree. Instead of being happy that Chidi was safe, They began to point fingers and mutter about Emeka's evil powers. They claimed that Emeka must have caused the tree to fall just to prove that his visions were real and powerful. The news spread through Omolo that Emeka was a powerful sorcerer who could control the elements of nature. Emeka saw the fear in his neighbor's eyes and knew that he was no longer welcome in the land of his ancestors. The following week was the most difficult time of Emeka's life because no one would speak to him or sell food to him in the market. Even the children ran away when they saw him coming, and his sister Adogo was told by her husband never to visit him again. Emeka stayed indoors, eating only the small amount of garri he had left in his kitchen and drinking rainwater. He felt like a walking corpse, waiting for the night to come so he could hear the voice that was both his protector and his curse. He wondered why the voice chose him and what the ultimate purpose of these warnings could be. On the 14th night of the course, the phone rang, but the atmosphere in the room felt different, almost heavy with sorrow. When Emeka answered, the voice did not sound like a leaf or a stone. It sounded like a man who was crying quietly. "Oh, tomorrow the danger will not be for a neighbor or a friend. Tomorrow the danger will be for you," the voice said. Emeka felt a wave of cold panic was over him as he asked, "What do you mean? What is going to happen to me?" The voice only replied, "They are coming for you at dawn," before the line went dead and the room returned to silence. Emeka did not sleep for a single second after that call because he knew that the villagers were planning something terrible. He packed a small bag with a few clothes and his remaining money, thinking about running away to the city where no one knew his name. However, he realized that if he ran, it would only prove to everyone that he was guilty of the things they accused him of. He decided to stay and face whatever was coming, but he moved his bed away from the window and sharpened his own farm knife. He wore a thick Ankara jacket to stay warm. As the morning dew began to settle on the grass outside, just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, he heard the sound of many feet marching toward his small house. He looked through a crack in the wooden door and saw a crowd of men carrying torches, sticks, and heavy stones. They were led by one of the village elders, who was shouting that the wizard must be driven out of Omolo before he killed everyone. Emeka realized that the voice had been warning him about his own neighbors, the people he had tried so hard to protect. He felt a deep sense of betrayal as he heard the first stone hit his zinc roof with a loud clang. The crowd began to bang on his door, demanding that he come out and face the judgment of the village traditional council. Emeka knew that if he walked out through the front door, they would beat him until he could no longer stand. He quickly climbed out through the small back window of his kitchen, landing softly on the damp earth behind his house. He crawled through the tall grass, moving like a snake, until he reached the edge of the thick forest that surrounded the village. He watched from a distance as the angry mob broke into his house and began to throw his few belongings into the street. He saw them tear his mattress apart and break his wooden table, searching for the charms they believed he used for his magic. When they couldn't find him, they set fire to his small house, and Emeka watched as his only home turned into a pile of black ash. He sat in the shadows of the trees, shivering with cold and fear, holding his phone tightly in his hand. He realized that the voice had saved his life once again, but at the cost of everything he owned and everyone he loved. He was now a homeless wanderer, with nothing but a ringing phone to guide him through the darkness. Emeka traveled for 2 days on foot until he reached a large, noisy city where no one cared about village rumors or ancient superstitions. He found a job as a laborer at a construction site, carrying heavy bags of cement, while wearing a dirty yellow shirt and torn trousers. He rented a tiny room in a crowded Face U building where the smell of gutter water was always in the air. Even in the city, he could not escape the 3:17 a.m. calls, and the voice continued to give him warnings about the people around him. He warned a fellow laborer about a falling scaffold, and he warned his landlord about a gas leak in the kitchen. People in the city were different from the villagers. They didn't think he was a wizard. They just thought he was a very lucky or observant man. However, Emeka was still living in fear because the warnings were becoming more and more difficult to follow. The voice started telling him to do things that didn't make sense, like walking 3 miles out of his way to get to work. He obeyed every instruction because he had learned that the voice was never wrong, no matter how strange the advice seemed. He was becoming a slave to the phone, unable to make a single decision for himself without waiting for the 3:17 a.m. call. One night, Emeka decided that he could no longer live this way, and he prepared a list of questions to ask the caller. When the phone rang at the usual time, he didn't wait for the voice to speak. He started shouting into the receiver. Who are you? Why are you doing this to me? Why can't you leave me alone to live his life? He screamed. There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment, Emeka thought the caller had hung up on him in anger. Then, the voice spoke, and it sounded much clearer and more familiar than it had ever sounded before. I am the one who survived when everyone else died because I was too afraid to act, the voice said with a heavy sob. Emeka felt his heart stop for a second because the tone and the rhythm of the speech sounded exactly like his own. He looked at his hands and then at the phone, a terrible realization beginning to dawn on his mind. He asked the voice, Are you me? The voice replied, I am you many years from now, living in a world of regret and shadows. Emeka dropped the phone on the floor, his head spinning as he tried to understand how such a thing could be possible. He picked the phone back up and listened as the older version of himself explained that a great disaster was coming to the country. In the original timeline, Emeka had ignored all the signs and had only looked out for his own safety while others perished. I lived while Chidi, Adogo and Mr. Okoro died because I was a coward who didn't want to be called a wizard, the older Emeka said. He explained that he had found a way to send his voice back in time to fix the mistakes he had made and save the people he loved. The older Emeka told him that every time a life was saved in the past, the future changed slightly, but the gate remained in his soul. I am trying to wash my hands of the blood of my friends, but the more I help you, the more I suffer here, the voice confessed. Emeka realized that the warnings weren't just about saving lives. They were about changing the kind of man he was becoming. He felt a deep sense of pity for the old broken man on the other end of the line, who was trapped in a future of his own making. But then, the older Emeka said something that chilled his young heart to the bone. The final disaster is coming tomorrow, and this time the price of life is very high, the older Emeka whispered. He told Emeka that a massive explosion would happen in the city market where thousands of people gathered every day to trade. The only way to stop the explosion was for Emeka to go to a specific warehouse and disable a faulty generator before it caught fire. However, the older Emeka warned him that the warehouse would be locked, and the only way to get inside was to trigger a silent alarm. If the police arrive and find you there, they will think you are a saboteur and they will shoot you on sight, the voice explained. Emeka had two choices. He could stay home and let hundreds of innocent people die in the market explosion, or he could go and save them, but likely lose his own life. The older Emeka told him that in his timeline he had stayed home and watched the smoke rise from the market from his window. If you choose to go, I will cease to exist, and you will die a hero that no one will ever know about, the voice said. Emeka spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor, thinking about the people in the market, the mothers selling tomatoes and the children playing in the dirt. He thought about his own life and how he had been running from fear ever since the call started in Omolo. He realized that being a hero wasn't about having special powers or knowing the future. It was about making the right choice when it mattered most. He put on his best Ankara shirt, the one he had managed to save from his house, and tied his shoes firmly. He walked out into the cool night air of the city, feeling a strange sense of peace that he hadn't felt in many months. He reached the warehouse at 3 a.m. and saw the faulty generator humming loudly, sparks flying from its metal casing. He broke the glass of the alarm box, and the loud ringing filled the empty street, alerting the security guards and a nearby police patrol. He walked quickly, using his knowledge of farm tools to loosen the fuel pipe and shut down the engine just as the lights of a police car turned the corner. The police jumped out of their vehicle with their guns pointed at Emeka, shouting for him to put his hands in the air and lie on the ground. Emeka did as he was told, but he felt a sharp pain in his shoulder as one of the guards fired a shot in the confusion. He fell to the ground, the hot blood soaking into his Ankara shirt, but he saw that the generator had stopped sparking. The market was safe, and the explosion that would have killed hundreds of people had been prevented by his actions. The police realized that he wasn't a thief when they saw the smoking generator and the tools he had used to save the building. They called for an ambulance, and Emeka was rushed to the hospital while he was drifting in and out of consciousness. As he lay on the hospital bed, he looked at the clock on the wall and saw that it was exactly 3:17 a.m. His phone, which was sitting on the bedside table, remained completely silent for the first time in months. He smiled to himself, knowing that he had finally changed the future and broken the cycle of fear. Months passed, and Emeka's wound healed, leaving a small scar on his shoulder that reminded him of the night he chose to be brave. He moved back to a small village near Omolo, but he didn't tell anyone who he was or where he had come from. He built a small house and started a new cocoa farm, living a quiet life and wearing his traditional Nigerian clothes with pride. He no longer jumped when the wind blew, and he no longer spent his night waiting for the phone to ring. He became a man of the community, helping his neighbors, not because a voice told him to, but because it was the right thing to do. He often thought about the older version of himself and wondered if that man had finally found the peace he was looking for. The mystery of how the cause happened was never fully explained, but Emeka didn't care about the science or the magic behind it anymore. He was just happy to be alive and to know that he was the master of his own destiny at last. One evening, Emeka was sitting on his porch watching the children play in the village square as the sun began to set. He felt a deep sense of contentment and gratitude for the life he had built after so much pain and struggle. He went inside his house, ate a simple meal of boiled yams, and went to bed early, falling into a deep and peaceful sleep. However, in the middle of the night, he was suddenly woken up by a familiar vibration coming from his bedside table. He looked at his phone and saw that the time was exactly 3:17 a.m., and his heart gave a small skip of surprise. He picked up the phone and saw the unknown number glowing on the screen, but he didn't feel any fear or panic this time. He looked at the phone for a long time, listening to the silence of the night and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. Then, with a calm and steady hand, he pressed the power button and turned the phone off completely. He placed it face down on the table and went back to sleep, knowing that the calls had finally stopped for good.